Alright guys, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and guess what? I've got quite a few more stories coming out here over the next few weeks. And I want to say thank you so very much for you guys bringing your encounters here and wanting me to kind of create everything around it for you. Also, I've got some interesting witnesses coming on for some interviews here shortly. Keith Browndorf, your books are on the way. Wanted to say thank you so very much for being subscribers, guys. Let's see, any other news? No, not really. I think I'm going to go back to loading the videos onto the blog itself at PacWestBigfoot.com, and if you're not a subscriber there yet, get on there and you can win I like to give a little something free away every single month, so you can subscribe there. Here's the deal. This encounter story I'm going to share with you right now. This one actually came to me secondhand. However, I do have an individual that I'll be sitting down with over the next few weeks who actually had a experience and I believe a sighting from this same general area. So very, very interesting. And this is actually a place that me and my kids go camping every summer with a church group. It's a father and son camp, so I take my boys and we go up there. So here is this week's encounter story. Night visitor at Lemolo Lake, Oregon. Bigfoot visits camper site at night twice. Oh, by the way, real quick, sip of Sasquatch coffee. And a big fat thank you to Gunner out there at SasquatchCoffee.com for the coffee. Awesome. I love to camp, and so does my wife. We're not much for hunting, but fishing, camping, and even hiking up around Lemolo Lake, Oregon is something we love to do, at least when Bigfoot is not around, that is. We had our first ever encounter. We had our first ever, and only to this point, encounter and experience with Bigfoot up around Lemolo Lake back in the late 1980s. I figured it was about time that we at least shared our story out here and let people know that yes, Bigfoot do in fact roam that area. So here's my wife's and mine accounts. And yes, my wife saw it through the screen of the tent, and to this day she gets a little creeped out about camping still. 100 times at Lemolo Lake. It was probably the 100th time we camped at Lemolo Lake when a Bigfoot entered our campsite. That was not a campsite. Twice. No kidding. This thing came back for a second raid, if you will. My wife and I, and let me set this up for you a little bit, well, we love to camp and fish. We were both born and raised Oregonians from the Portland area and eventually settled down in southern Oregon where things were a little less, well, to be honest, weird. We are the conservative mind, mostly, but not on everything. Southern Oregon became our home in the mid-1980s when we got married and bought a home between Glide and Roseburg, Oregon. Both of us worked in the nearby and albeit larger town or city of Roseburg. It was a little bit of a drive back and forth daily, but it was not bad as we were not literally in Glide. We were outside of it a bit. Some of our favorite hikes were nearby as well, like Susan Creek and Fall Creek, and sometimes when we felt like the ride, we would head up to the Twin Lakes area. For fishing and hiking, there was plenty of reservoirs, and of course Lemolo Lake and Rattlesnake Mountain for more hiking and whatnot. Fishing and camping. Well, Diamond and Lemolo were our favorites. That late spring would be Lemolo, and no, it was and is not the last time either. We still camp there. While the experience was rather frightening, we do not feel as though it wanted us or was really interested in us. It wanted something else. So here is what happened. Camping in La La Land. Pool Creek is the area we decided to camp at, and to tell you the truth, we were just past the edges of that near the lake itself, a small inlet actually, and the mosquitoes were horrid that year. They're usually bad there, but that was just crazy, I remember. It felt as though we had the whole lake to ourselves. The nearest neighbor was almost 75 to 100 yards at least away. Not to mention we moved our campsite about another 20 yards away or more from the actual site itself and made our own. Yes, that was against the rules, I am sure, but there was nobody around and nobody came to enforce the rules anyways. The fishing was good except catching those lame little chubs that were introduced a few years before that had almost taken over the lake completely. Hopefully one day they can get rid of them. To help out, we catch them When we catch them, we literally toss them into the bushes. These fish really are like a disease, so let the bleeding heart stuff go. These are not natural fish to this lake. But like I said, fishing was good, though we were getting a few trout for dinner that second night. We are tent campers. Well, today we are teardrop campers now, but back then it was nothing but a tent and the roughing it part. The first night was nice and uneventful, but the second night, well, those events would change our attitudes towards what is out in these woods for sure. Dinner, a game, and Bigfoot. The second day was great, a few drops of rain here and there, but we were expecting that. The rest of the week was supposed to be perfect for this time of year. After some fishing in the canoe around the inlet, we decided to fish from the bank while we listened to the baseball game on the radio. Yes, the reception was just fine up here. Actually, it was better than back home, to tell you the truth. We pulled up the canoe and tied it to a tree, got our poles back in the water, and decided to clean up the camp a bit while we cooked up some fish and boxed mac and cheese for dinner. My wife decided to go and check on the fishing poles just in case, and I decided to flip the fish wrapped in foil over and grab my book, kick back, and listen to the Mariners play the visiting Sox. The 4-game series was awesome, by the way. After a few moments, my wife called my name and had me look across the inlet to the other side. I had no idea what she was looking at. Well, at first, that is. After a moment, I noticed a person walking through the forest. A tall person at that. It was too dark in there by that time of day, I remember, to make out anything except they were walking, and they were rather tall. At least it looked that way. My wife was worried it was someone with the resort, and we were possibly going to get a tongue lashing about being so far from our own paid-for campsite. But the figure disappeared over the small hill and off to another part of the lake, we thought. We were out of the proverbial woods, we supposed, and left it at that. I got back to my book and dinner. My wife was fishing and listening in on the game. Dinner was great. The game was still going on, and the Mariners were up by 2 when it got dark. We put some larger logs on the fire, and the stars were out as the clouds disappeared. It would be a cooler night, but in the end, I probably would have taken absolutely cold over absolutely unbelievable. My wife decided to rinse the dishes off in the lake, and for some unknown reason looked across the inlet over to that hillside. She returned with a rather confused look about her. She said she saw that person walking again, this time closer to the shore, and they actually stopped for about 1 minute and seemed to be, as far as she said she could tell, was staring at us or her. Then they walked off again, but this time south into the woods, not over the hill. She was not frightened by any means, but she was wondering why they would be walking around near dark over there. There were no camping sites at all. Eventually, after a few minutes or so, the Sox knocking in another run, making her a little frazzled, we forgot about the passerby. Footsteps in our camp. It was getting late and the game was over. We decided to not continue being dessert for the mosquitoes and headed off to bed. I am a heavy sleeper. My wife is a light sleeper. Pretty normal couple, I believe. Either way, it was my wife who ended up practically giving me a Charlie horse waking me up. However, she had her hand covering my mouth. I was trying to mumble and speak, but she leaned in and held her finger over her lips, basically telling me to shush. It was then that I heard what sounded like footsteps, literally bipedal footsteps walking along the shoreline of the lake. Of course, that is not illegal, but whoever it was had to know we were there, and that was, well, rude. But my wife had more peculiar look on her face, I could tell. She leaned over again and whispered in my ear and said that seconds before she woke me, she noticed that the shadow of this person was pretty tall, taller than anyone she had ever seen before, huge in fact. Our minds, okay, my mind did flash for a moment to Bigfoot. I am a Pacific Northwester, for crying out loud. We laid there listening as whoever it was, walked along skirting the shoreline of the lake, here and there actually stepped into the water itself from time to time. At one point, it seemed to have stopped. I could finally see the shadow of this thing as my own eyes adjusted to the bright moonlit night and the shadow this thing was casting. It was huge. My best guess would be 7 to 8 feet tall. It squatted down and seemed to be moving its arms, and with the sound of the water swishing around, I believe it had its hand in the water. We also noticed that it would glance over its shoulder, while its upper torso and head would turn back towards our camp and just stare, I suppose. It did this for about a minute or so until it stood and continued walking down the shoreline out of sight and out of hearing distance too. Was it a person? A Bigfoot? We looked at each other for a moment until I think I gathered enough nerve to get out of the tent. The campfire was almost out, all but out at this point, so I grabbed some kindling, got the fire started back up. I do have to say it was eerily quiet. Even the crickets that did chirp were not as loud as they were earlier that evening. Whoever or whatever it was, I thought, may have still been nearby. But at that time, while my wife and I were a little on edge, we gave it up to being a person, a passerby in the night, who may have realized that they were near a camp and did move on. An hour later, the fire was roaring, and we were tired again. We headed off to sleep once the crickets were chirping loudly and the fire was popping. Really? Bigfoot in our camp again? It was late, real late, like around 3 a.m., if I recall correctly, but we were woken up by rustling around the camp this time. My wife, of course, heard it. Bigfoot, actually, walk into our camp. Her eyes were as big as golf balls. Seriously, when I woke up and looked at her, I could see the whites of her eyes in the low firelight that bounced over the tent. I also looked over to notice a tall figure in our camp. It was gigantic. Its shoulders were at least twice the size of mine, or even more. I did not get a chance to gauge it, but the tree by our tent and that this thing, it was just shy of 8 feet tall at least. Hairy. You could see in the backlight that this thing was covered in hair, not fur, but hair. I did not know until a few minutes later, but my wife and that thing looked at each other, face to face, with only the tent to separate them. She said it came from behind the tent itself, from the direction of a trail that wrapped around the inlet. She said the footsteps were very heavy and approached the tent slowly. That is how I was woken up at the time. It kind of smacked the tent, I guess. My wife let out a little squeal, if you will. She said it bent over, looked at the tent, and just so happened she was looking through the screen of the tent, a little window on the side. She said later that it smelled real bad, like onions and skunk. She did not get a real good look at the face because it was still too dark on that side of the tent. What she could tell, however, was that it was hairy, and while she could not tell much because of the lack of light, she could tell that its skin was lighter than its hair color and that its face was long. It had a raspy inhale and exhale as it breathed, and it put its large hand on the tent and pulled it away quickly, letting it kind of slap the tent. And that is when I woke up, and it had already taken 2 massive steps in between the campfire and our tent. It seemed to sway away from left to right as it stood there facing the tent. I was wondering if it was going to attack us or what. But after a few seconds or so, it walked over to the table where it knocked over our ice chest and took the fish in it. We would come to find that out in the morning. It was not completely proportioned like a human, but close enough to know that we were dealing with a Bigfoot. Tall, hairy, smelly, and you could just tell what it was. Not to mention, my wife said it was, and that was all I needed to know. It finally stopped rummaging through the ice chest and other stuff on the table. It eventually walked back down towards the shoreline, and from there it started walking off into the woods, where we believe it came from the first time earlier that night. The footsteps were heavy, I remember, and the next morning we made out some pretty significant impressions. However, because of the lack of decent rainfall at that point, it was rather dry still, and impressions were all we could see. My wife that morning was somewhat frightened, not too frightened, as in a scared out of her mind, but more like a nervous frightened. Lemolo Lake Bigfoot. We did not get out of the tent until daylight started creeping up, and that was not too much longer, actually, after it was gone. or at least we could not sense it was around any longer. And no, we did not pack up and leave either. We just moved back to our regular camping spot. Like I said, after a bit, we did not feel it was interested in us, just the food we had. Its long arms and huge hands did not make a big mess of everything as we thought either. Only the ice chest was knocked over and empty of the fish, while most of the contents on the table were left alone. Just a can of beans on the ground. Personally, it was quite the experience to see such a huge creature out there, especially after thinking to ourselves that we probably, most likely, have been around them before and did not even know it. They exist after all. Thanks for letting us share a story. And just so you know, we'll see you up there in June at Lemolo Lake with the family. However, I do have to say this. While I am hoping for another encounter like that one, I can't guarantee it. So I am not sure if we want another one either. I know my wife does not. Thanks.